Well, you have a few examples of microbiota nervous system communication. This is important so we can see how much this has already been studied, how much we know about which microorganisms do what, specifically regarding the enteric nervous system, and then the central nervous system. And on the other hand, because doing this also gives us clues as to what two-way therapeutic intervention is required. When I clearly understand what I need to achieve, like, I don't know, I need GABA or I need serotonin, I need to understand, well, which microorganisms signal that Bifidobacterium longum and Lactobacillus rhamnosus have a GABAergic, an anxiolytic action, meaning we're going to have an effect on GABA. One, reducing anxiety is important, but it's not like we can just boil down all the microbiota work to I have anxiety. So I'm going to take Lactobacillus rhamnosus. Okay. Here we have rhamnosus and reuteri, and you'll see certain bacteria that we'll hear about in different contexts because they are very, very important in regulating processes that are really relevant in our bodies. Well, what do I usually do? So you understand this idea of not working in such a reductionist way. First, when there's any alteration, we need to study well what we have in the gut, which groups are low, high, etc. Then we can start cleaning, nourishing, and planting. And when we have that sorted out, that's when we can focus on more specific elements that have a more particular effect. Start cleaning, nourishing, and planting. And when we have that sorted out, that's when we can focus on more specific elements that have a more particular effect. If I'm helping those with anxiety or depression, I need to see what's happening, as there could be things like ammonia affecting the nervous system. Just giving them the bacteria that gives GABA won't work. That's not it. But when they're better, if I see issues or the pathology requires it, I can use a probiotic to help. You'll have good material to dive deeper later. But once it's stabilized in the environment, if I still see symptoms or if the pathology seems to require it, then I can intervene with a specific probiotic for certain functions. There's a ton of information on this. And I think it's pretty accessible, but I believe you'll have good material to help you dive deeper later on. Reuteri is well known because it's used in the treatment of Helicobacter pylori, but a specific patent is used, which is called Pylopas, meaning it's a specific way of using reuteri. Well, reuteri increases oxytocin and improves social behavior. That's why it's one of the strains that is taken into account when it comes to autism, because it improves social behavior. Now, if the child is full of parasites, they have E. Colibiovar has, I don't know how many bacteria, and it increases intestinal permeability. Just giving reuteri isn't going to change their behavioral issues. This is obvious. Bifidobacterium infantis modulates the production of cortisol. Intervene acutely with Bifidobacterium for cortisol. Change environment for lasting effects. For Helicobacter pylori, relieve symptoms and restore balance. For example, if we have to intervene on cortisol, we can give Bifidobacterium infantis, but we have to keep in mind that if I don't change the terrain, I won't achieve much. For example, if someone comes in with Helicobacter pylori that's causing them a lot of discomfort and has a lot of symptoms, I try to start with something that reduces those symptoms, but I'm also working in the background to fix the environment and restore balance, okay? Because if I just give them a probiotic for Helicobacter and it helps, it still won't resolve the underlying causes that led to the overgrowth of Helicobacter pylori, which, by the way, is not an exogenous infection. Because if I just give them a probiotic for Helicobacter and it helps, it still won't resolve the underlying causes that led to the overgrowth of Helicobacter pylori, which, by the way, is not an exogenous infection. A lot of people ask, so does the whole family need to go through antibiotic treatment? No, not at all. That's not the way it works. It's part of our microbiota. Not everyone has it. I don't know if it's about 50% of the population that has Helicobacter pylori as part of their microbiota, not as a pathogen. But if it overgrows, mutates, and becomes resistant to hydrochloric acid, it can colonize the antrum of the stomach, or we can change the conditions in the stomach. For example, with proton pump inhibitors, we can lower that pH. And in that way, we can allow microbiota from other areas that have a different pH, like the duodenum, to colonize part of the stomach. Modifying pH is a big deal. We really need to keep this in mind. In a short time, 2001, doesn't generally have a big problem. But if it persists over time, it causes issues for the entire microbiota because we're changing the pH. pH is part of the condition of the environment that determines who lives there. We're going to modify the entire microbiota. So Bifidobacterium infantis modulates the production of cortisol, reducing the stress that comes with a loss of bacteroides and an increase in Clostridium. So it could be a bacteria to consider in these cases where we have an increase in Clostridium and the person is under a lot of stress. So what I was saying earlier about Helicobacter, so it doesn't just stay there, is if the person is experiencing a lot of discomfort, I can work with Lactobacillus reuteri. I can work with grapefruit extract. It usually works really well. I can work with oregano essential oil alongside the probiotic. I can add butyrate, which will help reduce inflammation, a good probiotic, and also something that acts like an antibiotic, like propolis extract, grapefruit extract, or oregano essential oil, which is what I use the most for its antibiotic effect. I can start with that to try to reduce the symptoms and also to avoid the person taking medications. So that's when it makes sense to do something that has a quick effect, but we must address the whole background, or we maintain that dysbiotic microbiota, increasing Helicobacter. You also need to consider the hypochlorhydria and the medications the person is taking, because besides proton pump inhibitors, there are also other medications that affect this. Always consider the whole individual. You also need to keep in mind the hypochlorhydria and the medications the person is taking, because besides proton pump inhibitors, there are also other medications that affect this. So, well, always consider the whole individual at this precise moment. Bifidobacterium and Lactobacillus induce remarkable improvements in social behavior, both in early life and in adulthood. My Bifidobacterium, the Bifidobacteria are very, very important, and Faecalibacterium improves intestinal permeability and in turn helps with depression and anxiety. I can work on that phase of sealing permeability, making sure the intestine has no holes, so to speak, that it has proper permeability, a selective passage of nutrients, but not of toxins. Well, Faecalibacterium and Bifidobacterium are useful for this purpose. Faecalibacterium doesn't exist in a probiotic on the market, and we feed it with resistant starch, which you can easily find online on how to take resistant starch with food, through rice, sweet potatoes, legumes, etc. It's very simple. Well, that's the favorite food of Faecalibacterium, which will also give us butyrate from it. Butyrate is fundamental. It's a really fascinating and intriguing metabolite, such as, I think that in the protocols, in the phased strategy that I usually do, I always include butyrate, depending on the context at the start, or in this stabilization phase. If the mucosal nutritive microbiota is doing well, instead of providing butyrate, we can provide resistant starch, either through a product or through the diet. Spirochetes, ruminococcus, and butyrococcus have been linked to neuroinflammatory states, bacteria carrying LPS, the microbiota carrying LPS, related to the overexpression of alpha-synuclein, which worsens motor symptoms in Parkinson's. That's why, if we have Parkinson's and there's an increase in LPS-carrying microbiota, by reducing it, we'll see how much it improves. And depending on how much it improves, we'll know to what extent the microbiota is responsible for that Parkinson's or not. It's directly related. Many years ago, I read a study that said the neural changes that happen in Parkinson's first occur in the intestinal neurons. So it would be a good way for early diagnosis. It's not the same to biopsy intestinal neurons as it is to biopsy cranial neurons from the central nervous system. In any case, we should always look at how the microbiota is involved in these diseases, work on diet, work on the microbiota, and focus on detoxification. Many of them improve a lot, some resolve, others get better, but it's really, really important to keep this in mind. Campylobacter jejuni worsens the ability to adapt an emotional response. So a high presence of Campylobacter jejuni could be one of the culprits behind emotional issues, adaptation problems, and so on. These are just examples. There are many more. Just imagine all the members of the microbiota, the number of different microorganisms that live there, and the multitude of processes that studying each of those microorganisms can involve. And of course, it wouldn't just be that. It's not the same to have elevated Campylobacter jejuni in a context of some balance as it is to have it elevated in a state of severe dysbiosis. There, it will be able to exert, all its harmful effects will happen more easily.